welcome back. This is going to be a fun chapter. In this session, I'm going to make an art blockout for the church. So I'm going to export this blockout geometry to Maya, and I'm gonna work on the design a little bit. This was a really fun asset to make, and I didn't necessarily follow one specific church. I had a few references that I liked. So I just made up my own church. I looked at a few different references and I took elements that I liked from each one. And I also made sure that the church has a similar style to the buildings because I want to reuse the same trim sets, the same materials that I use for the other pieces for the church. So here is my main reference. That's where I started with. But I also like the simplicity of this one. So I'm gonna take some elements from here, like maybe the tower bell, and then I'll go from there. So the first step here is to export this to FBX. And because I'm only going to use this as a reference, I don't really need to move it to 0, 0. I can fix this in Maya or in your modeling program, because I couldn't find a way to to move the group to 0, 0 before exporting. Because once you create a group in Unreal, it doesn't behave like the way groups do in Maya, for example. They behave in a weird way. So if you know a way of move the group to 0, 0, please let me know, because that's a nice little thing, but it's no big deal. So what we want to do here is combine these meshes and then place the pivot in one corner and then make sure the rotation is correct, or at least on the ballpark, because I'm only gonna use this as a reference. I'm not gonna model like on top of it. This is gonna be just a wireframe that I'm gonna keep as a ghost in my scene. But if you want to get the correct rotation, you can just go back to Unreal and take a look at which coordinate, like the rotation you have in the piece there, and then you just copy on your modeling package. That will place it perfectly on the grid. So here I created a layer in Maya, and I made that layer like this wireframe mode, because now I can just make a clean model using that original blockout as a guide. I don't like, now it's time to let your imagination flow. You don't necessarily need to match it one to one in a lot of cases. You can just use the original blockout as a starting point, and then you change the shape, you change the silhouette, like whatever is needed to make it interesting. Yeah, I think for now let's just watch the modeling for a little bit, and then I'm gonna come back and explain what I'm doing. Hello back. So yeah, here I've been working on the top part, which has this cool ornament. Um, One thing to keep in mind here is first is to work from big to small. So at first I worked on the big shape, on the silhouette. And once I was happy with that, I started adding some details for scale. Um, so that's why I added this thing on top, because I think it really helps with scale. And now that I have this shell, I'm going to start adding some details, but these are details that should be easy to change if I change my mind later. So because this trim now that I'm making, I started from that face that was there at the top. Later on, if I need to change the angle of that face, it's okay, because I can just remake this trim. There are several ways to fix that. I can either repeat the same steps, or I can just take a segment and then tweak it so it fits, and then we can go from there. So when work on big POI pieces like this, try to work from big to small. Uh, it's very tempting sometimes to start with details, but if you don't have the whole place, at least in a very simple form, you for sure get some stuff wrong. Like the scale is gonna be wrong, or the piece is not gonna look harmonious. So start big and then go small. Like leave the details for last, because once everything else is established, it's very easy to spend as long as you want adding details, and the chances that the details are gonna work well are much higher than if you just start making details from the first moment. And also in big pieces like this, you want to have a variety of different scales, So I have the big flat walls, but then I also have this little ornament at the top. You want to have a range, because that's what makes big stuff look big. You need a reference. Like if you just put a big door in there, it's gonna look overscaled unless you add some frame around it with to give the scale sense, like to give that sense of scale. It's also always good to remind about the 80-20 principle, like you can leave 80% clean and then 20% detailed. That's a way to make harmonious stuff. This chart surprisingly didn't go through crazy iterations. When it got time to finalize, I stuck pretty close to the design that I'm creating right now. Yeah, so here I'm showing what I was just talking about. You have the door, but then you have this frame around it, and I really wanted to have something like that on this piece too. Yeah, these big POI kind of pieces, they're always fun to make, because this is where you can put your details and like the fancier ideas. And if you can make them work well with the general buildings you have, that's a killer combination. yeah, this big window is something that I really wanted to have in there from the beginning, because I think I saw in one of the reference, because I imagine inside the church during the day, if you have like this big window where the sunlight is shining through, that's gonna look very cool. Sadly, I didn't have time to make a cool like stained glass kind of design for the window, but here's an example of like a place where that kind of effort would pay off. Like it's, if you think about environment art in terms of resources, like we have limited resources to make these environments. Like we don't have all the time, we don't have the finance, well, most of us, right, like don't have the finance to be just working for free all day. So we need to be clever about our efforts. So if you're gonna make something like a stained glass window, which is gonna be very time consuming, put it somewhere where it's very visible, right? Where you're gonna get your like a big bang for the book, your book. This is a common mistake that I see beginners make sometimes. Like they work on these very detailed, like advanced models, but then the models are all in the shadows, or like they're not in the main parts of the composition. So definitely pay attention to this. Like put your effort where you're gonna get the biggest returns in everything in life, right? Like if you're gonna dedicate yourself, if you're gonna put the time, put it in something that's gonna give you good returns. And I'm not talking like just monetary returns, but like the sense of accomplishment, like proud in the quality of a work. So put that effort where it really matters. Be smart with your energy and your time. So going back to the model here, I'm gonna add some like this little trim, and you can notice that I didn't cut the geometry. I'm just placing it on top of the geometry, and the reason for this is it's gonna be very easy to move it around if I want. And so in a way I'm making this string modular. It's not gonna be exported as a modular piece, but it's made modularly inside Maya. That's how you want to approach a lot of these POIs. You don't want to be modeling, like unwrapping everything from scratch, because think about it, like this kind of trim, you only need the profile, and then you're gonna repeat it everywhere, right? But if you start by cutting the geometry and extruding, and you're gonna have to do the same work several times, because you're gonna have to unwrap the same piece several times, pretty much. But if you just make a segment and then you use that to build the rest, you save a lot of time. So when you work on these big pieces, it doesn't mean that everything needs to be unique. It just means that it's going to be exported as one piece. You don't need to build this kind of stuff in a modular way unless it makes sense. Sorry, you don't need to export this as a modular kit unless it makes sense. But you can build it in a modular way inside your modeling package. Use the both of both worlds. Yeah, so now I'm going to work on the door frame that I talked about before. And you see that a lot of my modeling starts from the underlying geometry. I just duplicate those faces, so I selected those faces and duplicate to a separate object, because I just prefer to work this way. I don't like to work everything in one big mesh. It's okay to combine them later, but it's just messy to work that way. Like if this door frame was integrated into the underlying mesh, like what would I gain from it? Like pretty much nothing that I can think of. but it would be very hard to change later. You would make this very monolithic kind of piece. So it's kind of like having a floater. If you bake normal maps, like if you go for like the hard surface kind of workflow, you always have floaters, right? So I have the same mindset when I'm working on geometry. I have these floaters, like things that I put on top of this shell underneath. Because later, if I change my mind and I don't like this door frame, or what if I want to have a really detailed door frame and I want to sculpt this, I can just export the door frame. I don't need to export the whole building to ZBrush. But if it was part of the mesh, like attach it and all the vertices welded, it would be very hard to do that. And because I'm going to use vertex colors for the blend, for blending materials, I want to make sure that the vertices in the shell, the vertices in the shell, that sounds cool, kind of like Ghost in the Shell. They all line up, so you don't have these weird, hard cuts. Yeah, so I'm going back and forth on my reference. But you see, just a few minutes and already looks much better than what I had before. It's starting to look like a church. And I also wanted to, I took the precautions to make this church not so religious, right? Because it could be offensive to someone, or like if you're having like very explicit like religious icons, like some people might not like that so much. So this church is more like a caricature of a church. It could be any religion. Yeah, so trying this more angled shape for this big window, which kind of it reflects a little what the doorway I have underneath it. By the way, if you're working Max or Blender, you can just have a symmetry modifier on top. You don't need to duplicate and mirror like I'm doing all the time. This is one of the Maya shortcomings, sadly. This is another one to remember in Max. This kind of, like, it handles those kind of corners much better than Maya does. You have to clean up the geo by hand a lot of times. So here's what I was saying before about working modularly inside your modeling package. Like, instead of making that from scratch, I just duplicated. And to take it even one step further, I could even unwrap those pieces. Even if I don't have a trim set yet, I could lay out the faces, on the grid, because then later, once I have the trim, I can just move the parts so they match the right trim set. But when I was making this, I was just I just have it in mind that I was gonna have to redo them later. It's no big deal. Yeah, so notice how the big shape didn't really change. I'm just detailing that big shape that I started with. I'm adding these little trims. I'm adding the border at the bottom, the door frame, the windows, but the general shape stayed the same. So for this trim, I could even have reused it, the one I made before, but for some reason I just modeled it straight. It's no big deal. Such a simple geometry. But yeah, it's very fun to work on this kind of architectural pieces that are gonna reuse the same assets that you're gonna make for the rest of the map. So I'm gonna use the same trims and the same materials, same decals, and you can get a lot of mileage out of like a few materials. As long as the shape looks different, you can get away with reusing the same thing everywhere. And it also helps a lot with consistency, to have like a limited library of materials instead of just having tons and tons of different materials. The chances that they're not gonna match are pretty high, like the bigger they get. And also you start running into some pretty nasty performance problems. Like things are very hard to fix, especially if you're using crazy high res materials from Megascans or something like that. So I always try to work very lean. I keep my things simple. I try to reuse things as much as I can, because all these little steps, they guarantee me that it's going to be easy to optimize the map later. Yeah, there's a whole video later on performance, and it's something that you should always have in mind when you're working on real-time environments. No matter what kind of hardware, no matter what kind of engine, you always have to know about performance, like about what's expensive to render. Even if hardware gets better, there's going to be more features, and every feature has limitations and drawbacks. So to be like a world-class environment artist, you also need to be very knowledgeable about the software and the hardware and all that stuff. So I see a lot of newcomers that they completely ignore that part and they just make whatever. And that works to have visual things on your portfolio. But once you're working on an actual game, you don't want to be the person that's creating all the performance problems in the game. You know, like you want to work in a clean way so you can have more, you know, so you can have more animations, you can have more effects, more whatever it is. But yeah, I'm getting pretty happy with how the church looks like, and it's about time I tested in game. And if you notice, during all this time, I didn't really export the church to Unreal. And the reason for that is sometimes I like to do that only after something is more established, because it takes a little bit of time to export stuff to the game, right? And if you're like jumping back and forth from like Maya to the game, like, oh, you make this wall a little bit bigger and then you check it in game, and then you come back and you tweak it a little and then you check it in game. Like, not only that adds a lot of time over time, but also it breaks the concentration. So when I'm working on things like this, I just try to be as concentrated as possible. So during all this time that I was working on it, I didn't stop like a single moment to check email, or, you know, like, or even to check it in Unreal, because that would break my concentration. And so I just started this with the goal of making this church Blockout in 1 hour. You know, like, I just took like, okay, 1 hour, I'm gonna make the church Blockout, and then I'm gonna put it in game, and then I can tweak from there. But if you don't have this kind of goals, it's very easy to just be kind of lost, you know, like working in things that might not necessarily get to where you want to be. Or even worse, putting a lot of time and not getting the results you're looking for. So treat your concentration as a resource as well. And I know that I only have a limited amount of concentration per day. So I try to make the best out of those hours that I can work 100% focused. And I think this Blockout is a great example, because it's actually a pretty big piece in the environment, and I was able to get the idea across in less than an hour, which to me is a big victory. This is the kind of things that, like, back in the day, early in my career, I would spend like days like being a little unsure about the design and going back and forth, and oh, this scale is not right and all this stuff. So now I just go, you know, and then if later on I'm like, oh, I don't like this church, I want to try another design, that's totally cool, because I only spent 1 hour working on this. You know, I'm not married to this design yet. So now I'm preparing this model for export, and I'm going to break it up into a few pieces, because I want to mirror that side view. And because the facade is going to have a lot more details than the back, I'm also separating that for a light map sake, you know, so I can have more resolution on this part. If you are working in Unreal 5, you're going to have other limitations with Lumen. So I go back to what I was saying before about knowing about performance. So take the time to go to the Unreal documentation and just read up like on how Lumen works, how light mapping works, you know, like know how those things work, because then you're gonna make assets that are much more effective. So because here I want to prioritize light map resolution, I'm gonna break up the parts that are more flat from the parts that are more like details, you know, like small details. because when you look at the UVs, these big surfaces, they take up a lot of space, and you want space in those surfaces. You don't want them to be tiny. And for details, it's kind of the other way. Like, they don't really need a lot of UV space usually, but if you have them together, they are gonna take up a lot of space from the big surfaces. Yeah, I was having some problems here with the layout UVs, and it was some malformed vertex somewhere. I had to fix that. Yeah, so let's do some cleanup. Always keep your outliner clean, or at least workable. Maya has this tendency of creating a lot of leftover stuff that just stays there, and every now and then you just have to go there and delete all those references, because otherwise it gets really hard to work on these kind of models. I'm doing something now that I should have done in the beginning, which is centering the piece, because this is symmetrical in the center, so it makes sense that it's gonna be in the center of the scene as well. So now I'm gonna create the different export sets, and they're all gonna share the same pivot. So all the pieces have proper light map UVs. Now it's time to just export to Unreal and drop them in the scene. Yeah, so now let's see how that looks like in Unreal. Yeah, so I drag and drop those pieces in Unreal, and I'm just gonna replace them now. I'm just gonna replace the old geometry with this. So by mirroring that part, I'm saving some memory, because that geometry information is only gonna reside once in memory. Like, if I exported that side with both sides from Maya, even though the geometry is the same, they would count as extra vertices in memory. But because is the same piece mirrored, I'm saving a little bit of memory in there. And you always want to do this when you have very detailed pieces that are symmetrical. Yeah, like it looks like I forgot to grab the centerpiece too when I moved, so let's fix that. But because they all share the same pivot, I can just copy the coordinates of one another. So look how much that helps making the scene feel more alive already. And that silhouette looks really cool because there's nothing behind. You can really see the silhouette of the church. So that's a great example of what a POI building is. POI means point of interest. So these are your, let's say, your postcard shots, right? Most of the map, I use the same general buildings, and I'm using them in different ways. But going back to that 80-20 ratio, it feels good when you use this ratio, because it gives some sort of harmony. So I have 80% of my map is made of the same reused buildings. And then I have 20% that's unique, and the church is only one church in the map. There's only that one. So it makes that church feel special too. All these things they're going to be unconscious to a lot of people, but from my experience, they just help the environment feel more pleasing when you have this ratio. Because if everything is unique, you start not having any areas of rest. Like if everything is special, nothing is special, because special things, they are only special in comparison to things that are not special. if you understand what I mean. So it pays off to put your detail where it's going to be seen, like I said before. And a lot of times in my career, when I was less experienced, I would put all this work in some like side building that the player barely sees. It's a very common mistake when you're not thinking about the big picture and only thinking about the immediate thing you have in front of you. I'll always keep the forest in mind. Like the forest is made of individual trees, but to make a good environment, you need to think about the forest and not just the trees, because especially this kind of environments, right? Like this is not a scene, this is an environment, this is a map. You can walk around, you can explore, so you need to think in a different way than you would if you were just making a corner, just a beautiful scene, like just one big building. And then you can go crazy with details and stuff. But if you're working on an environment, on a map, you need to be a little bit like a producer too. You need to split your resources in a way that makes sense. And personally, I think it's much more pleasurable to me to work on this kind of big environments than just a little corner. Because the little corners is okay, like anyone can make them look awesome, but who can make a full environment by themselves, that runs well and looks good, and and it takes a lot more skill. And I just think it's more fun, it's more rewarding as well, because you can walk around the environment. You're not just a camera in the viewport, you're a player in a real environment. You have all the directions that you can look at. Yeah, there was one thing that I tweaked here to death, was the placement of this church. I nudged it like a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right, like thousands of times until I was happy with it. And I'm still not happy, but it's good enough. Yeah, I just did a quick test here, putting the tree there, and like doesn't make sense because then it covers all the detailing there. It would be okay to have some bushes in that little square, but why put all this work into making this awesome church and then you put a huge tree in front of it? Like it really doesn't make sense. Yeah, here I'm trying to figure out how soon do you see the church after you make that curve. This is something that I mentioned before in a previous video that Disney parks do very well. Like you make a corner and then you see some cool landmark. So I'm keeping this in mind. Like having some kind of details that you can only see after you get to this area. So from here you cannot see the church. But then after you make that curve, you just see it at the end of the composition. So it drives you to walk towards there. And I think if the church was visible all the way from here, it would start looking a little busy, maybe, like, you know, like maybe a little conflicting with all the buildings I have. So it's nice to have this kind of reveals. And notice how I'm walking around the map. Like I'm walking from all directions, you know, like trying to imagine that, like how the player coming from this side, they're gonna see what are they gonna see when they turn that corner, you know? Like what are they gonna see when they walk backwards? So from here I got the backdrop in the back that helps with the composition. You know, there's always something interesting to look at. And to get to this level of composition, you really need to iterate. You know, you start with a big picture and then you iterate. So try the street one way, try the other direction, you know, like I'm always trying all these things. But then at some point you just have to call it. You have to say like, look, that's what it is, and I'm just gonna finish this. Even if it's not perfect, because otherwise you're gonna be tweaking forever. And the truth is, like, we never really finish an art piece. We just, at some point we just stop. You know, like at some point we just get to like a stopping point, either because we get a deadline or because we are ready to move on. It's the dilemma of the artist, right? Like what's the point that you finish it? But yeah, trying to get this kind of postcards from every corner. Yeah, so now the Blockout has some simple materials. It already looks much better. You like, I look at this and I can see how it's gonna look like when it's finished. And that's the point, that you want to get all your pieces before you move on to actually finalizing them. You should be able to look at these art blockouts and be able to see how they're gonna look like finished. And in an ideal case, you're only gonna flesh them out. You know, I'm not gonna have to remake this church. I'm just gonna place materials on top, and I'm gonna tweak the trims and all that stuff, of course. But I'm not gonna remake it from scratch. You know, like that's the foundation that I'm gonna finish the model on, which is a different mindset than I had before, right? When I was just doing the design blockout, I knew that stuff would be throwaway work. So it didn't matter if I was dirty with the geometry, which is what you can see with the ground now, which is one of the pieces that I'm going to make next. You know, like in this design stage, it's very dirty. The pieces are all Z-fighting. You know, there's all kinds of shenanigans going there. But once I make the art block out, even though I'm not going to finish it, it's going to be a clean geometry that I'm going to finish later. Yeah, I think the composition is working really well right now. The church feels important because it's centered at the end of the road. So after a quick lighting bake, everything looks much better. Yeah, so this was a very rewarding asset to make, very fun to create it, to like invent my own church in a way. But yeah, next I'm going to work on the archway building, which is the last blockout building that I have. This archway here. And the ground mesh, and then my art blockout will be pretty much done. So see you in the next chapter.